Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, designing basements where kids can play and relax. Information at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm Danny Wysentowski, in for Elaine Cha. Earlier this month, more than 100 people gathered in a church in South St. Louis. What drew this congregation together wasn't spiritual or celebratory, it was fear. This was a legal clinic teaching married LGBTQ couples how to set up medical powers of attorney, a legal document that allows a person to make healthcare decisions for someone else. It's a situation that no couple really wants to think about, but with the Trump administration in power and a conservative majority in the Supreme Court, couples like Michael Dorn and his husband Andrew Hernandez are preparing for the worst.
We've tried to discuss it amongst ourselves about what would happen if we lose our valid marriage. We know that our love is still there. That doesn't change that, but it somehow kind of makes you feel less than. I'm hoping that these documents will still be enforced and that those cannot be taken away from us.
And that was Michael Dorn, who spoke to St. Louis Public Radio's Chad Davis at the Legal Summit on March 5th. And events like that one is just one example of the legal chaos playing out in the lives of queer people across the country. And that chaos has come from state legislatures trying to roll back rights for LGBTQ people, and at the federal level, there's an unfolding judicial crisis over whether a court's order must be followed at all if the president says otherwise. For queer people, and especially those who are trans, this moment is a multitude of worries, and not just in their relationships, but in the workplace, in schools, in their driver's licenses and passports. There is so much at stake, and that's what we are going to spend today's show talking about, the law and the ways LGBTQ people in this region are trying to grapple with it. Joining me today are two attorneys. Sara Marler is the founder of Marler Law Partners. They're trauma-informed lawyers who focus on family law and estate planning. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Ramona is a corporate attorney with the law firm Wilson Elzer. Before that, she spent more than a decade as a public defender and a homicide prosecutor here in the city of St. Louis. Ramona, great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to this conversation this afternoon.
Yeah, and rounding out our panel is Merrique Jenson. She is a St. Louis native and currently the executive director of the Kansas City-based nonprofit Transformations. It is the only statewide trans organization in Missouri. It supports trans girls and youth in Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. Merrique, it's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sara, I want to start with you on the subject of powers of attorney. This was the subject of this legal clinic that more than 100 folks came to. Talk to us about what these powers of attorneys actually are.
So essentially, it is a protection for people to make a decision as to what they want, who they want by them when they need to make decisions related to their health care and they can't speak for themselves.
And these are rights that are not included under, the legal rights afforded by marriage. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, frankly, you should have it no matter what. But it was particularly something that came up when we had our summit, that people were really scared about who's going to make decisions for me if something should happen to me. And typically if you're married, a lot of times hospitals will defer to a spouse, not always, but they will. But if you've got your marriage and people are worried about it being invalidated or they're not able to get married, then the concern becomes what's next, or having their loved one being barred from being by their bedside.
And Merrique, I understand you got one of these powers. You went through this process yourself in Kansas. What brought you to that decision?
Yeah, actually, so I went through it in Missouri. I worked with so shout out to our LGBT law firms and folks there, because I went with a law firm in Kansas City, Missouri. Actually, my attorney's trans themselves. And I went through it because I spend so much time responding to violence and trauma for trans folks that I had a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have certain things in place. And one of those was power of attorney. I've been on my own sort of without blood family support since I was a teenager. I'm 41 now. Hopefully I look good for it. But, I went through that process because I was also like, if something happens at this point, I'm also worried about my dogs. I'm worried about the things I have. I'm really worried about what could happen to myself with my medical care? Would I be on hormones? Would they stop me? I know a lot about that, even just from like working on homicide cases and working with murdered trans women in Kansas City, where some of the women who were killed, their blood relatives got the responsibility of their bodies, and they got to then present them back as male at their actual funeral. And so I've seen what that looks like for trans folks in all sorts of ways.
Wow. Now, I'd like to invite our listeners into this conversation. What questions do you have about the law that of LGBTQ rights at this moment? Are you considering things like powers of attorney or even moving to another location? So give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Now, I should mention, Merrique, you make this point that this is not just something for married folks to think about, but Ramona and Sara, I should point out, you are married to each other. Ramona, was powers of attorney or these questions, were these things that were on your mind before we kind of got into this legal landscape?
For us particularly, no, because at the time that we had decided we were going to get married, while we had to go to California to actually do it, we were able to go to California, get married, came back to Missouri. Missouri was required at that time to acknowledge our marriage. And then in moving forward, it wasn't a concern until the latest administration has taken over, and we've started seeing some constitutional interpretations from the U.S. Supreme Court come down, completely changing the whole bedrock of the laws that we've seen for several decades.
And we'll talk about some of the warning signs that you are seeing in these various levels of courts. I'm curious though, just from the legal summit and talking to these people, what stood out to you about what had brought them to that moment and to considering this very difficult decision?
During the legal summit, we heard from a lot of older individuals who have lived before we had same-sex marriage that was legalized across the country, and people who had lived through sodomy laws and sodomy being illegal. And it was only as recent as 2003 that the U.S. Supreme Court gave everyone the protection away from being criminally prosecuted for same-sex relations. And through that, a lot of those older individuals had shared what they had experienced. And one of those main concerns was being in the hospital, needing your loved one by your bedside and not having them there. And also the concern of family members who are not supportive, all of a sudden being there, stepping in, making these life-altering decisions.
Well, the other thing that people were worried about too and brought up, and this was something that you and I both experienced as public defenders and as prosecutors, was like the AIDS crisis and the criminalization around that.
That's what I was thinking about too.
Yeah, that is actually a point that was brought up by another person who I talked to this week. He was actually one of the organizers of that event. It was Chris Ando, and he did mention that history and the way that it makes this moment feel familiar.
Out of the legal summit, it became clear that people were really worried about what happens if somebody got sick. Many of the older people in the community remember the AIDS crisis. They remember being locked out of hotel rooms. They remember estranged relatives coming back and being in charge. And that was top of mind.
And that was Chris Ando, one of the organizers of the Powers of Attorney Legal Clinic earlier this month. He's also the publisher of Out on STL magazine. I'm curious, these lessons from the AIDS crisis, which was an example of the government not just failing, not just interfering with legal rights, but refusing to act in the face of incredible evidence. Are there lessons looking back at that strikes you now as people are making these decisions?
Oh, absolutely. I think about when I'm working and I'm advocating with young people, and even now a lot of trans youth still have very clear messages, and those messages are that they are disposable, that they are sinful, and that they're wrong. And those messages were born out of the HIV/AIDS crisis, because when we saw that folks were allowed to be disposed of, like when nurses and doctors who were supposed to take care of everyone refused to take care of them, right? And shout out to the lesbian community who helped to sustain the work at the time and sustain our community, we saw that those messages became very clear. And so a lot of my background has been working with LGBTQ young people, including, having built a program here in St. Louis. And so when, I was working with these youth, we would often, even if they came from really loving families, they would believe that they were disposable. And I think right now, more than ever, we're seeing that message very clearly from a federal and a judicial level.
We have a caller from St. Louis. Spencer is on the line. Spencer, what comment or question do you have for us about this conversation here?
Hi there. Yes, my name's Spencer. I have been in St. Louis the last 7 years, and a lot of trans people I've met here are thinking about leaving, and it's been a big thing for me that I don't want to leave and that I want to stay and support my community. And I would love to hear more about how y'all are doing that in your communities as well.
Yeah. Merrique, would you like to take that?
Sure. Yeah, Spencer, thanks for the question. I mean, I talk about this a lot. It's what I call the great transmigration, right? Which is what's happening right now. And I think that it is something very particular to certain types of folks, right? I want to just start by laying the land. Most trans people in Missouri do not have competent gender affirming care, period. So before all of this stuff was happening, the care that we were getting wasn't great. Right? There's a reason why a lot of trans folks were going out of state to get their care. I'm somebody who's had multiple surgeries. I tried going to Kansas City for that. And even that process to get surgery and to get basic care, they still require WPATH model. So the World Provider of Transgender Health. What that meant was that they were saying, I still needed to have a therapy letter. I've been living in my truth for a very long time. People know me, right? I don't need to have any cisgender person, so someone who's not trans, tell me that I am trans, right? I know who I am. But a lot of the mainstream institutions and hospitals still require this. So what that's looked like is that even before, right, 2023, when we really started to see this come down, we saw that trans folks were not really getting great care. If you go and get a hormone shot, a lot of the doctors give you the same regimen, right? Everybody's treated the same, which is not how it should be. It should be that they're testing your blood, they're really looking, you can microdose, right? There's so many ways that hormones and gender affirming care can look that doesn't really exist in the Midwest. So that's one. Then when this happened, we also saw that now the care that was being provided was actually now being pulled away from the folks who had access to it. And as an organization that serves primarily trans women of color and trans girls of color and trans kids in survival mode, so kids that don't have supportive guardians and families, we know that a lot of the folks that were getting served weren't our communities. And so I think the reality now is that what we can lean on, right, because I'm resiliency based, and I think what we can lean on is that trans folks have been rocking it and doing amazing stuff for a long time. So whether or not, right, a president or judicial system says that we're allowed to be ourselves, we're going to continue to exist.
Yeah, and we're going to continue talking about the issues that are facing trans folks, particularly through this conversation. I want to, move a little bit. I want to rest on the powers of attorney and marriage issues as well. It is something that has been bringing people into St. Louis. Sara, I wanted to ask a couple questions because there's so many rights and so many things that are associated with marriage and things like that. I had a couple questions asking about Social Security benefits or what happens if my partner dies, things like that. The ripple effects of these rights seems to really play out and in scenarios that are hard to think about. How do you bring people into both thinking about things that they don't want to imagine happening to them and their partners, but also the things that they really count on for marriage to bring to them?
So I think the best thing you can do right now while we feel I don't know how everyone feels, but I feel like I'm in limbo. So even though Ramona and I are married right now, and even though I personally don't think that they will invalidate our marriage, I do worry about the future ability for people to marry, right? And I'll say what I said at the summit. That doesn't mean go run out and marry someone right now. Please don't do that. But I do think that, aside from that, you can do other things to protect yourself, or, if it becomes a problem again and you're having to, it goes back to the states, and some states, recognize it and some don't, which is where we were when we got married. There are other things you can put in place, like proper estate planning, right? So wills, trusts, things like that, where you can carry out your wishes and make sure that everything is given to who you want it to be given to.
And This question, though, this limbo that a lot of folks are feeling like they're in, a lot of folks are looking back to the past, not just to the AIDS crisis, about how our culture and our country responded, but to some specific legislation. Ramona, I wanted to ask you if you could take us a bit back to the Defense of Marriage Act. This was something that was in 1996. How did we get from there to gay marriage being legalized? Could we be dragged back to the legal systems of the mid-90s, where some states could acknowledge marriages and others could reject them?
So I'm going to go through several decades of law and analysis and talk about it on a very high level, starting with the Defense of Marriage Act, which came about in the early 90s. What had led to that was some states had started legalizing same-sex marriage. And because of our Constitution, we have a clause in there referred to as the full faith and credit clause, which ultimately requires states to acknowledge court orders and legal decisions made in other states. It helps the United States stay united. And what DOMA did was it took away full faith and credit as to same-sex marriage, and it also invalidated same-sex marriage on the federal level. So when you talk about Social Security benefits and you talk about any type of federal benefits, you did not have a legal marriage, even if it was legal in your state, for purposes of those federal benefits under DOMA. Fast forward, the U.S. Supreme Court eventually invalidated those two clauses under two different cases. The first case came out in 2013, which was the Windsor case, and that removed that federal ban, which then did allow for the Social Security benefits to apply for those who were legally married. And then back over in 2015, the Obergefell decision, which I believe in my world, that was the biggest deal to me because that finally said that we could, it invalidated the full faith and credit prohibition of DOMA. So then while Sara and I could have went to California, got married there and stayed there, our family's here in Missouri. So we were able to come back and then be legally married here in Missouri.
Right. And like a lot of folks who are here in Missouri, that law passed, it felt permanent, and now here we are. And we're going to continue talking about that when we come back from our break. We will be back shortly to continue this conversation about this moment of uncertainty and fear for the LGBTQ community. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, designing basements where kids can play and relax. Information at callmosby.com.
Welcome back. I'm Danny Wissentowski in for Elaine Shaw. We're spending today's show talking about LGBTQ legal rights and the uncertainty facing these queer people across different parts of their lives, including marriage. Before the break, I was talking with one of our guests, Ramona Gao. She's a former public defender and a homicide prosecutor from the city of St. Louis. She's now with the law firm Wilson Elzer. Our other guests are Sara Marler. She's the founder of Marler Law Partners, a trauma-informed lawyers who focus on family law and estate planning. And also with us is Merrique Jenson. She's the executive director of the Kansas City-based nonprofit Transformations. So Ramona, you were giving us a bit of a history lesson about how queer marriage actually became legal, its process going from the Defense of Marriage Act in the mid-90s. There are a couple big red flags that people are looking at of why this right could actually be reversed. What are the ones that really stand out to you?
Well, the biggest red flag came when the Dobbs decision came down, which was the U.S. Supreme Court decision that sent the abortion rights back to individual states. And within that decision, specifically, same-sex marriage was mentioned, and Justice Thomas recommended, or at least put a red flag out there, that just like Dobbs was being sent back to the states, same-sex marriage, along with other similar issues, needed to be invalidated as well on the federal level.
And what would that look like? What decision or case could actually undo what has been there for 10 years?
So ultimately, what needs to happen and for it to end up at the U.S. Supreme Court, a state would need to pass a law that invalidates same-sex marriage. And then an individual who wants to get married, who has harm from not being able to get married, would have to file a lawsuit. That lawsuit would then have to move all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it is not an easy scenario. However, there's a little bit of foreshadowing put out there by Justice Thomas, essentially putting everyone on notice that if it's introduced to them, they very well may take it up.
And again, we'd like to hear from you, our listeners, this hour. What questions do you have about the law on LGBTQ rights at this moment? Are you considering powers of attorney or other questions about your legal rights? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Now, I'd mentioned this before, but Ramona, Sara, you are married to each other. You have gone through this process in a personal way. I'm wondering, looking back 10 years, did this feel like this was something that was going to be permanent? Did you ever wonder that this could be rolled back after having such a fundamental advancement in the way that the law looked at its own citizens?
When it came out, when the case law came out, I felt like, oh my God, we're free. We're good. We're free. We're okay. So no, I did not see this coming personally.
I didn't see it coming either. And I think most people, when they go and get married, they make that commitment and that decision. And at that point in your life, this is for a lifetime, till death do us part. And that absolutely was my consideration. And even as an attorney, knowing that the laws can change, that U.S. Supreme Court decisions can change, I had no appreciation for how fast we would be in this situation.
But I also didn't see them reversing affirmative action, reversing abortion. But I can tell you, when I talk to friends of color, they tell me I saw this coming all day long.
Yeah.
Merrique, I'm hearing you.
Well, I think one of the critiques right now, right, about marriage is that now we're seeing the larger lesbian and gay community start to care again because they're feeling a sense of threat and safety being taken away, where trans folks have been scraping to have any sort of recognition of rights. And even within our own LGBTQ community, we see that our gay and lesbian leaders are willing often to throw us under the bus. In Arkansas, one of the states that we cover, there was a secret meeting that was held with some of the LGBT stakeholders in the state with some of the Republican legislators. And they said basically, hey, if we create two genders, if we say there's only two genders, will you support this? And they said yes. And they made sure that there were not trans folks and there were not, quote, radical queer folks in the room. Even on the questions that you all asked, right, on the Facebook page, there was somebody who commented and said, we're good when it was LG, right? But the BT stuff is an issue. And so I think that has such larger implications, which we could certainly go into. But I want to just name that marriage is a real thorn in the queer and trans organizing world, right? Because now that it's being threatened again, we'll see funding and dollars and resources be looked at for marriage in a way that is not at all for trans folks. 1% of all of the donations that are given to LGBTQ communities, only 4 cents is given to trans-led orgs. So I think that there's a lot to unpack around how even our larger queer and LG community, lesbian and gay community, sees trans folks. And this is also a ploy, right? This is intentional to make it be that we have to pick and choose and to cause a distraction, to cause shock, so that really, right, Trump and his billionaire friends can go and, misbehave and do whatever they want.
On that level, these political discussions, how should opposition legislatures, respond? It's clearly creating some divisions. But a point that you brought up before, Merrique, about how this is affecting trans youth, young people. These are not the people in the legislatures. And I spoke with Mioni Hickman. She's the community engagement lead at Moho Justice Coalition. Got some fans here in the studio, and she said this moment is particularly hard on young trans people.
For our youth, it's scary for them because here we are, they see us, and how we finally got to a point to where we can thrive and we can, live comfortably. Well, I won't even say comfortably, but, we got some kind of leeway, some kind of breakthrough to where, okay, here we are. We got all of this stuff going on for the LGBT community, and then just like that, it's like starting to get ripped away. It's very, very heartbreaking. It's very scary. I can guarantee that, it's unfortunate. However, like, suicide rates are going to go completely through the roof. Depression is going completely through the roof. I think that right now everybody is in some state of depression.
And that was Miani Hickman, Community Engagement Lead at Moho Justice Coalition. Her point about depression, about mental health, I think this is something that a lot of folks are dealing with, the people who are closest to them. Sara, I understand that you have a therapist on your own staff. You have to deal with this as an attorney with folks who are feeling this level of desperation, but are trying to find some legal avenue. How do you balance this, and how do you talk to folks who are feeling under threat?
Right. So we do. We have a therapist on staff, and I love that about us, because it is, our court system is not appropriately set up to protect people. People in the court system often have their therapy records subpoenaed. By having a therapist on staff at a law firm, it's all protected by work product. So good luck. Can't get it. But it's
smart.
It's protecting people to be able to come in and say what they need to say. But it's also helping people process their emotions, process their feelings, their fears. People have to remember to try to keep their fear right-sized. I think people also need to make sure to take some kind of action. And we also right now cannot let anyone be isolating. So the biggest thing I think we can do for each other is reach out to each other when a new story comes out and someone is directly impacted by it. Reach out to them, send them a text. How are you doing? I see you. Healing happens in community. I'm a big, big believer in that.
Yeah, Marie, you have, this is something I was curious about your impression also, working with young people. They do not have, a long historical context of, where things used to be bad, but, this is all happening. It is the first time perhaps they are seeing these sort of forces describe their own lives and affect them. Are you seeing levels of depression or things that do concern you? How do you address that?
Well, I'm going to give you the real answer. I don't know if this is what y'all want, but I'm going to say that it depends on the young person, and it really depends on the guardians around them. And what I mean by that is, so Transformations, we formed, and for 4 years we operated and ran trans youth groups. And we had actually 2 groups, one for young people 12 to 18 years old and another for trans girls. I think that there is a narrative that exists that trans young people will kill themselves, that they're going to be suicidal, that they're going to die. I think that's a really dangerous narrative. I think it's really harmful from a trauma-informed lens as well, right? To lean into that. I think in general, if we know something's happening to any community, let's not share that directly with them, right? We might know it and we keep it to inform us, but we don't go and reach out to them and be like, oh my God, I saw that, this other band happened. How was that, right? Instead, we're we use that to inform us. So for young people especially, for many years, right, I've seen a certain type of parent, and I call them the helicopter parents of trans youth, who are the best parents, right? They want their children to be loved, safe, and supported to such an extent that anytime anything happens to that young person, there is a thing like, my child should never be misgendered. My child should never have the wrong pronouns used against them. My kid, deserves love and respect. Of course, every young person in this world deserves love and affirmation. But that is not the reality for what it's going to look like for trans youth. Then you go to the ballroom moms, right? Black, Latina, trans women who have been running their own communities, who have been taking and chosen family for years. And they're telling these young kids as well who are trans and saying, listen, real talk, this is not a world for a weak person. And that's a different kind of narrative, right? Because what it does is it creates a level of adversity in that young person to say, should I have equal rights? Of course. But when things happen, how can I respond from within? And I think that's something that's getting lost. I think that there's a lot of wanting to sort of almost, and I say this as a trans person, I want to be clear, right? As a trans woman of color myself, that there is a way that I think right now trans youth have so many amazing role models of trans people. And what I've actually seen is often the parents of these trans kids don't even put their children in touch with the older trans folks themselves. And so I think that right now it's super important that, and I love that you said that about not being isolated, right? Because isolation is the number one technique used in schools, juvenile detention centers, school to prison pipelines, right? Juvie, that we see when LGBT youth are considered too much, are weird, are dangerous, we isolate them, right? It's used in prisons. And so I think that at the same time, these young people more than ever need to be connected to peers, but also to trans adults that are like resilient. That is really, really important right now more than ever.
And, I think as you say, Merrique, these, trans youth, the things they're going through in a lot of ways don't have anything to do with these lawmakers, the things they're growing through, the things they're learning, the connections they're making. But in a really practical way, when it comes to identification and documents, this is where things really start getting complicated and scary for a lot of these folks. And I want to talk a little bit about this subject of identification because I talked with Keith Rose, who's a paralegal. He co-founded the St. Louis Name Change Mutual Aid Group, and it operates stlouisnamechange.com. And this issue, in Missouri particularly and elsewhere, this past August, Republican lawmakers in this state complained to the Department of Revenue about a trans woman who was using the women's locker room in a private gym. As innocuous as seemingly that complaint could be, it created a policy change around how trans people get their identification. And Keith told me earlier this week that the result of this change has been confusion and desperation.
Because they've removed Form 5532, there is no written explanation of what the exact requirements are. Even the idea that surgery is required, it's not outlined what exact surgeries would meet their requirements. I've spoken to people at DOR over the past few months who have basically told me that someone should send in their medical records and a DOR employee will decide if it's sufficient. I don't think these people have been medically trained. I asked one of them for a list of procedures that would be accepted, and they didn't even know the technical terms for different surgeries that people get for transgender for gender transition. And so it is really concerning to me that this agency is the one who is deciding what is and is not sufficient, because that's not their experience.
And that's Keith Rose describing a change in Missouri's policy for changing a name on identification. He's referring to this particular form that the Department of Revenue just simply removed from its website after complaints by Missouri legislators. That has changed really fundamentally how trans people are supposed to get their IDs, and they're now supposed to supply evidence of surgery before they can get their gender markers changed. And that is, as Keith referenced, still not absolutely sure that is the proper way to go about this. And he said that even what we know about this process is raising more questions.
Right now, we're seeing a huge influx of people who just don't know what to do. And because there's such a patchwork of legislation and because the laws are changing overnight with no input and no forethought, people are terrified. We're getting contacted by people who are currently abroad on passports that may or may not be recognized as they try to re-enter. And they're asking, is it okay for me to come back to the United States, or do I need to overstay my visa in Europe? These are real questions. And then on the other end of that, I have clients who are often in and out of homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters here in St. Louis City. And most of those shelters are going to place them based upon the gender on their ID. So we have people who have fled domestic violence who are now looking at being turned out of the shelter where they have finally found peace because these laws are going to prevent them from replacing their ID whenever it expires.
And that was Keith Rose, co-founder of the St. Louis Name Change Mutual Aid Group. Ramona, I saw you were reacting to Keith's points as he was talking there. What stood out to you about that?
Well, from the legal perspective, the confusion that stands right now is a separation of powers issue between the state and the federal laws. Missouri actually has a law on the books that requires the surgical procedure, although it is very vaguely mentioned in the statute. And it appears from me as a lawyer that the previous administration appreciated that because of that separation of powers, the rights needed to be respected on the federal level, which is why that form was created, and there was no fight in regards to changing individuals' gender identifiers. Unfortunately, this issue has now raised, and it also, as an attorney, makes me wonder if Missouri's trying to set up a lawsuit to potentially head on up to the Supreme Court. I did also want to add that there's a really, really big U.S. Supreme Court decision that's anticipated for this coming June, specifically related to the transgender population. And the issue before the court is whether states can forbid transgender youth from seeking surgical procedures, which then, of course, ties back into the Missouri statute. The law requires a surgical procedure. However, we're also are we going to let laws stop surgical procedures? And so that decision coming out is going to give us a lot more indication as to where all of these other issues are going to continue to head.
We need to take a quick break, but we're going to be back shortly to continue this conversation with our LGBTQ panel. I'm Danny Wysentowski. This is St. Louis Public Radio.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Danny Wysentowski, in for Elaine Cha. We've spent our show today talking about the different ways that changing laws and court rulings are affecting the LGBTQ community. My guests in this conversation are attorney Sara Marler. She's the founder of Marler Law Partners. And also with me is Ramona Gao of the firm Wilson Elzer. And finally is Merrique Jenson, the executive director of the Kansas City-based nonprofit Transformations. Before the break, we were talking about some issues over identification specifically affecting trans people. Merrique, what are you hearing from folks about how these identification issues are affecting them? Obviously, identification doesn't tell you who you are, but it can tell you where you can go and what kind of maybe jobs you can get or what you can do officially. What are you hearing from folks as they are grappling with Missouri and other states changing these standards and sometimes changing or taking their identifications?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely a very careful dance for trans folks right now around what IDs they have, what identification they have, they don't have. I know I have multiple trans leaders and trans folks that I know who have expired IDs, have expired licenses, and they won't go renew them because it would have their gender that they were assigned at birth or their sex assigned at birth back on their ID. I know another trans woman who was at a job in employment, and she, the place was not already very affirming to her, and they were requiring updated documents, and she didn't have her updated ID. She had been there for 4 years, and they used that as cause to fire her. So now she also lost her job. And I think that there's just a lot of unknown right now. There's also strategies that trans folks are using to get around this, which I think is important to know as well. And I think it's important to really talk to attorneys and to legal experts who are very familiar with LGBTQ issues, especially trans issues, because there are ways that the law is intentionally vague. I want to go back to that clip also that Keith, that you played that Keith said, and I think that's so true. I actually have permanent residency in Washington. That's where I live, but my organization's in Missouri. So I spend a lot of time going back and forth. Washington is also one of the states that so many trans folks are going to because it's so affirming and it's so inclusive in terms of what it's providing. And I had gone through the name change. I had gone through all of the documentation updates. I get to Washington. I'm so excited to have my ID updated. And the gentleman, this very nice elderly white man, looks at me and he's like, "Oh, well, you're a woman." And he just puts me as a woman on my driver's license, right? And I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, I went through all this stuff just to have somebody look at me, go, "Boop, boop, woman," right? And so I think that is real, that like in some ways this is all about people's perceptions, our comfortability with who's coming up. I know other situations that have happened in Missouri where folks are still able to go and get things they need. So I think that it is a very particular dance right now. And I want to just say that IDs certainly are needed, but there are many ways that trans folks are thinking outside the box. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, we focused a lot on marriage. We talked about trans youth. And there's kind of a union between some of these subjects, and it involves young people and kids in these marriages. Sara, when we're talking about concerns over changes of marriage rights, marriage laws, you have 3 children, I understand. Is this an additional danger and uncertainty? What happens to these incredibly important relationships that are just, you can't imagine them being interrupted?
Right. So one thing that I've been advising a lot of my clients to do who are married but didn't adopt children, maybe had same-sex couples, particularly the women who've had children, and it comes at a cost, right? Like there's something that makes me kind of uncomfortable of having to tell someone they have to adopt their own child. But it's truth. Birth certificates are not court orders. And so short of having a court order to show that you are a legal parent, you don't have that. And so frankly, what I've been suggesting is people have confirmatory adoptions done in situations where they can essentially say, we are both parents of this child. Ramona and I, our youngest child, our son, we adopted. And so that worked out for us. We're both on the birth certificate, but we also have a judgment and court order that says we are both his parents. However, if she had had him or I had had him, even though we were married, I would still want the other one of us to legally adopt him so that we had a court order that says we are both his legal parents.
Is there a scenario that scares you the most as a parent in this situation?
Oh my God!
I know it's the uncertainties are kind of spiraling out there. But what do you want people to think about? These are things that are so troubling that I think people are pretty motivated to just move on and to have other things in their life take their attention. What do you want people to focus on when they are thinking about the most important people in their life?
I think what scares me are 2 things: is families being separated, parents being kept from their children, and then frankly, I didn't personally live it, but my mom was a nurse during the 80s and 90s during the AIDS crisis, and those were patients that she lovingly treated, and I heard about the stories all night, every night, and going back to that terrifies me.
There are folks I've talked to in the last week who are afraid. They've shared a lot of the same concerns that you do. They are also organizing. They are turning to the people in their lives. I talked with Jada Peaton. They are a social work student at Washington University and a community organizer here. They're an admin of a Facebook group called Queer Exchange STL, and this is what they told me about what this moment feels like to the hundreds of people who are interacting and creating community online.
We know how to self-organize. We have been doing that since our existence, like from Stonewall to the AIDS epidemic. Like, we are very well versed in being able to take care of each other and mitigating harsh terrain. So that was something that we have been kind of reminding people throughout the group and telling people to make connections with each other because at this point we're all we have. And also our identity exists beyond the state. So even if the state decides not to recognize you, it's not like we cease to exist.
And that was Jada Peaton, who is the admin of the Facebook group Queer Exchange STL. Sara, what do you take from that statement about people organizing together where they are?
It's like I said before, I think healing comes in community. We have to take action, and action has to start not at this giant, huge level, but sort of in a small level, grassroots. I also wanted to kind of tie back to what I was saying earlier. When I reference like what happened with the AIDS crisis, like that's the fear I have right now for the transgender community. Because they are the people who are trying to get medical care and have the biggest threat of medical care being taken away. And that's where I have a real fear is what's going to happen with them. I feel like that is, in a way, and maybe I'm overspeaking, so I'll let you speak to this, Merrique, but that in a way, it's not my story to tell, but that in a way is my fear is the new AIDS crisis.
I love your heart. You have such a great doing even as you're talking about your firm and doing all, like you said, trauma-informed, but I'm like, you're also doing harm reduction. Like, you all are doing really important harm reduction work to reduce harm, to think about what can always be safer. I think, for transformations, we're the only statewide trans organization in Missouri. In 2023, when we started to see whim of this happening, we went across the state, not just in Missouri, but Kansas and Arkansas, and we did a series of town halls with trans folks. We did a town hall actually in Kansas City. Mayor Quentin Lucas came to it. We actually released a report. So it's actually on our Instagram at KC Transformations. You can check it out, but it's called the Liberation Tour Report. And it talks about things in there, and it talks about the health access and gender affirming care bans that exist, the school and sports bans, the bathroom bans and criminalization, but then strategies that trans folks are using is mobilizing our base, shifting the narrative. So really taking control of the narrative is so important. Storytelling work is super important right now. Thinking about, more rural outreach, how we build community relationships, how trans people can still be visible. One of the things that's come across the board is that trans folks are also thinking about divesting from pride festivals because prides in general are not doing a good job of talking about what's happening to trans people. And they don't have a really great idea of like the safety, the sort of the lethality assessment of what's happening to trans folks. And so I would say that right now, more than ever, it's important for folks, especially if you are somebody who is cisgender, who's not trans, to invest in trans-led work, to invest in trans spaces. So it's really important that trans people have private spaces that they control to meet, to strategize, to connect. Old school it, right? Go back to the 1970s, 1960s movements, go back to the lesbian separatist movements, right? Like, it's coming out of a house. It's going to come out of a community center. It's going to come out of a church basement, right? Those are where we started. We're going back to there. So I think having access to spaces that we're able to control, because right now all of this is about sort of, there's already laws that exist about publicly demonizing and criminalizing trans folks. Arkansas has a law that basically bans trans people from really even like performing or dancing. It's like a public performance ban for drag folks, for folks in drag, but that's really interpreted for trans folks. And so I think that we just need to be thinking about how we are investing in trans people to connect, to strategize, to have more legal clinics, to have more opportunities to do town halls, to have more opportunities to hear from national organizers.
Yeah, and in our last minute and a half or so, I just wanted to get a sense from our attorneys here. What maybe are there action steps that people should be taking in this moment? Things they should be thinking about. Ramona, what do you think people should really be tangibly looking at in terms of what they can do, as long as the law still allows them to do it?
Well, organization is huge, and I would like to remind everyone that when the U.S. Supreme Court sent the abortion question back to Missouri, Missouri did not ban it. We passed it. You still have a right of choice here in Missouri. And so organization and getting out and voting is what you can do. If November 3rd, 2026 is not on your mind or not on your calendar, it needs to be there. You need to get out and vote. You need to push everyone. Your one vote does matter.
And Sara, in our last 30 seconds.
Donate. If you hear a story that is negative, go to the ACLU, go to some website and find out what people are doing to organize to fight against it and join them, volunteer, donate.
All right. Thank you so much. Sara Marler is the founder of Marler Law Partners. They are trauma-informed lawyers who focus on family law and estate planning. Sara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Ramona Gao is a former public defender and a homicide prosecutor in the city of St. Louis. She is now a corporate attorney with the law firm Wilson Elzer. Ramona, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Danny.
And finally, Merrique Jenson. She's a St. Louis native, currently the executive director of the Kansas City-based nonprofit Transformations. It's the only statewide trans organization in Missouri that supports trans girls and youth in Missouri and as well as Kansas and Arkansas. Merrique, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I love my trans family.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Our production intern is Jada Jones, who did so much work on this segment.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.